Welcome, everybody, and thank you for joining today's WEIM Governance Review Committee General Session meeting. Please note that all audio connections are muted at this time. To enter the question queue, you may click on the raise hand icon at the bottom of the Zoom window. With that, I'll turn the conference over to Burton Gross with California ISO. Please go ahead.
Thank you. Good morning, everybody. This is Burton Gross, Deputy General Counsel here at the ISO. I'm going to cover a couple of the procedural niceties to start the meeting, and then I will turn it over to Chair Hampton for the substance of the meeting. And of course, the first thing to do is roll call. So I'll do the roll call in alphabetical order for our members, starting with Michelle Beck.
Present.
Tony Braun.
Here.
Andrew Campbell.
Here.
Suzanne Cooper.
Here.
Eric Eisenman.
Here.
Angelina Elizabeth.
Present.
Therese Hampton.
Here.
Amanda Ormond.
Here.
John Prescott.
Here.
Pam Sporborg.
Here.
Thank you. Lisa Tawney. I know Lisa was possibly going to be a little late. Is she on yet? It sounds like not. We'll record it when she joins. Rob Taylor.
Here.
Rebecca Wagner.
Here.
And Cameron Yurkowski.
I'm here.
Okay. Well, we have a quorum, so we can move on to the next agenda item, which is an opportunity for public comment to the extent there's comment on things other than what's on the agenda. There will be opportunities as the call goes on to comment on the substance of the agenda. So if we could just take a moment to see if there's any public comment other than what will be on the agenda. If you do that for a moment, we'll check and see.
If you would like to make a comment, please click on the raise hand icon at the bottom of the Zoom window. It looks like we have no comments at this time.
Okay, then we'll move on to the last procedural item, which is the approval of the March 31st, 2022 general session minutes of the GRC. And for that, we only involve the voting members of the committee. So if I could get a motion from one of the voting members of the committee and a second to approve the minutes, that would be great.
It's Rebecca. I'll move.
Okay. Rebecca moved. Any second?
Pam will second.
Okay, thank you, Pam. And now we'll just walk through the vote, the vote on that. Michelle Beck.
Aye.
Tony Braun.
Aye.
Andrew Campbell.
Aye.
Suzanne Cooper.
Aye.
Eric Eisenman.
Aye.
Therese Hampton.
Aye.
Amanda Ormond.
Aye.
Pam Sporborg.
Aye.
Just in case Lisa Tawney has joined, I'll call her name. Lisa, are you on yet? Okay, no. Rob Taylor.
Aye.
Rebecca Wagner.
Aye.
And Cameron Yurkowski.
Aye.
Okay, well, the minutes have been approved. And with that, I will turn it over to Therese Hampton.
Great, thanks, Bert. If we can go to the next slide. This next slide is, actually, can we go to the next slide? There we go. Slide is just a reminder of who all the Governance Review Committee members are, which you just heard us all roll called twice, but this is a reminder of who the Governance Review Committee members are. And let me just thank you first for joining today and give you a sense of what our purpose and objective is today. As we talked in February when we talked about scope and we laid out process, we said that we would try and follow the EDAM market design process as market design influences governance. And yesterday they released the straw proposal for market design. We have in mind to issue a straw proposal in June, kind of as a follow-on from what we've seen from market design. And so today what we want to share are the things that we've been talking about, some of the major elements that we think will be part of this draw proposal, some different concepts and ideas that we've been thinking about and want to get some feedback. And we'll talk at the end of this meeting about how we want to do outreach over the month of May. We've got some different places where we will be presenting and seeking feedback. We also want to have some informal outreach with parties to kind of hear your reactions to some of the things that we're thinking about. So we've broken this presentation down into sections. Different GRC members will give presentation on those sections, and then we'll stop at the end of each section. If you have any initial feedback, that's great, or even just initial questions or things you want us to consider, we're happy to hear that. And then, as we'll talk about at the end, we'll be doing more outreach throughout the month of May. So if we go to the next slide, I think our title slide was just a little bit out of order, but if we go to the next slide, I'm going to hand this over to Rebecca Wagner to talk about the principles to guide the GRC in this process. Rebecca.
Thanks, Therese, and welcome everyone. Thanks for joining us on Friday morning. The principles to guide the GRC started back with our straw proposal for our original work for EIM. And what we did was look through these principles, and you can find them in the original straw proposal, and there's also a link to them, as you can see on this slide. We just decided to update those slightly to reflect the lay of the land now, as well as where we're headed with EDAM. So the overarching principle generally stays the same. We just added an S to markets. You see that in the parentheses and about the third line, just to reflect that there are more than one market. There is more than one market in consideration when we look at both EIM and EDAM, and that participants would be may engage in EIM but not EDAM. So just reflecting, we're kind of keeping this all together as a consideration and as an overarching principle. The next three bullets are new bullets to our original guiding principles. The first one is to reflect that as we develop an EDAM governance model or proposal, that we continue to move towards an autonomous Western energy imbalance market governing body. So oftentimes we hear the concept of independence, and sometimes I believe that's conflated with the notion of autonomy from the California political process. So this is recognition of that difference and trying to become as autonomous as possible. The second bullet, the key piece of this one, is to reflect the difference between the ISO market participants and the ISO balancing authority. So basically think of your investor-owned utilities that have to, more than likely have to participate, and those who are prospective EDAM participants who will be operating in a voluntary nature. So we wanted to reflect that balance between those two perspectives and keep those in mind as we evaluate governance proposals. And then finally, we want to ensure that where we're headed with EIM and EDAM governance keeps in mind and supports and advances a future governance structure appropriate for a multi-state RTO. So we don't want to do anything that kind of would have to be unwound as we move to the fully integrated, liberated ISO, and just making sure that our work is a step forward in a positive light and consistent with what that might look like in any kind of future transition. So that's all I have. And just as a reminder, these are just the principles that we are going to use as we evaluate our draft and evaluate our straw proposal for review for you all in the future. So I'll stop there and turn it back to Therese.
Thanks, Rebecca. This is a good chance just to ask if there are any stakeholders that have questions or comments or thoughts about the principles that we use and the role of these. So operator, if you can give instruction for comments if folks have them.
All right, once again, if you do have a comment, please click on the raise hand icon at the bottom of the Zoom window. All right, looks like we have no comments at this time.
Okay, let's go to the next slide. The next section is got a number of slides to it. I'll be going over this, which is the delegation of authority. What we opted to do was give a little bit of background, both about what some of the elements of delegation of authority are, what we decided previously, and then some questions and options that we want to talk about for EDAM. So we can go to the next slide. There's really three elements to the delegation of authority that we talk about: the type of delegation of authority, the scope of delegation of authority, and then the dispute resolution associated with that delegation of authority. So what we've identified here is there's really primary authority and joint authority, the way in which the ISO Board of Governors can delegate authority to the governing body. And so under primary authority, this is written generically. This isn't intended to capture how it's done for EIM or anything specific. It's kind of generically how primary authority would be dealt with. The governing body approval is required under primary authority. The decision is placed on the ISO Board of Governors consent agenda, and a majority vote of the Board of Governors is required to remove an issue from the consent agenda. If that happens, the ISO Board of Governors can only remand the decision. They can't alter it, the decision itself, or the approach. Under joint authority, both the governing body and the ISO Board of Governors approval is required. So both require a majority vote. And then it's recommended that that vote take place in a joint meeting of both bodies. What we've noted below is that advisory authority is important, and it's informed by what's defined under primary authority or joint authority. So typically, let's put under primary or joint, then advisory is, kind of what's not under that authority and what seems relevant to the market participants. If we go to the next slide, this talks about what our previous recommendation was. And for the Western EIM, we recommended, and the ISO Board of Governors and the governing body jointly approved, that whereas the governing body previously had limited primary authority, that it be modified to joint authority over an expanded set of issues. And we really came to that conclusion after several stakeholder iterations and conversations, because we felt it was appropriate. It expanded the decision-making authority of the governing body. It gave confidence that the governance structure represents the interests of all stakeholders, which the set of principles that Rebecca went over, that's one of the key factors in the set of principles and one of the overarching objectives. And one of the big areas of conversation that the GRC had the last time around was the collaboration that we thought joint authority created between the EIM governing body and the ISO Board of Governors, and the goal and objective of really having broad understanding of all market participant interests and impacts. And then it just recognizes that the real-time market is, or the EIM is deeply intertwined in the real-time market. So that was the previous recommendation that we made. If we go to the next slide, kind of what are the options that we're thinking about now? Both. We're looking at both for EDAM, both primary and joint authority. And we kind of struggled through some questions, wondering, is there something under joint authority? Is there a different decision-making process that would better promote considerations of all participant and stakeholder interests? So for those that, and this I think would be a conversation we would want to have with stakeholders. If there's somebody that thinks, I prefer primary over joint, what is it about primary that you prefer over joint? And is there a different way of looking at joint that might make it better promote the things that are important to you? Under primary authority, would a different approach to the ISO Board of Governors consent agenda process provide greater autonomy for the governing body and stakeholders, recognizing that there is a consent agenda process that would be required, but is there a different approach to that? And then ultimately, the big questions from our perspective is there something about the EDAM market structure that impacts our previous evaluation of joint versus primary, and if so, in what way? And are there options that we have not yet considered that you would like us to consider? So that's in the type of delegation of authority. If we go to the next slide, we'll talk a little bit about the scope of the delegation of authority. These are actually, I think we looked at all three of these the last time. So the scope of delegation authority. So what issues, once we've decided, as we decided that it was a joint authority, what are the issues that were subject to joint authority? And it could be rules that apply to an EIM or an EDAM participant in their capacity as an EIM and an EDAM participant. It could be rules that impact EIM or EDAM participants in their capacity, or all market rules, all real time, and if under EDAM, it would be all day ahead market rules. So those are kind of the different options that that both we considered for EIM and that would be open for us to consider for EDAM. If we go to the next slide, what we ultimately recommended for the Western EIM and the ISO board and the governing body jointly approved is that the delegated authority, the delegated joint authority, would be for all rules that apply to Western EIM entities in their capacity as EIM participants. And we went this way because there was an expansion of the governing body's previous authority, and we felt that that was really important. It also maintained their advisory authority on other issues that impact EIM entities. But one of the key features for us is that this apply to rule really provides for a clearer way to do the decisional classification process and determine what should be under joint authority and what should be under advisory authority. Specifically, the impact rule is kind of vague and ambiguous and could be subject to broader interpretation. And also we kind of tested this apply to rule by doing a section by section review of the tariff, and it really seemed to appropriately assign decision authority. So that was the decision we made last time. So what are we looking at this time? If we go to the next slide, the options that we're considering this time are all the scopes that we looked at last time, but we're also exploring a scope that includes all day ahead and real-time market rules, but with notable exceptions for those things that apply uniquely to full ISO market participants in the ISO balancing authority area. So taking that big view of all day ahead and real-time market rules, but carving out those exceptions where you can say this really only does apply to those ISO market participants in the ISO balancing authority area. And our questions here are similar to the last time. What is it about the EDAM market structure that would kind of change our previous evaluation, make us want to rethink or put different factors in for consideration? What other options would you have us consider? And then if you can think of, what are those things that might be the day-ahead and real-time market rules that apply uniquely to full ISO market participants in the ISO balancing authority area? Okay, last section of delegation of authority. If we go to the next slide, we'll talk about dispute resolution. Here's the current approach. Under joint authority, if the ISO Board of Governors and the EIM governing body do not jointly pass a proposal, it gets remanded to the stakeholder process. So the first time if they don't agree, it goes back to the stakeholder process to go through and find a different proposal. If the revised proposal cannot achieve joint approval, then the two bodies have a choice. They can decide additional remand, send it back, or the ISO Board of Governors submits a filing to FERC. That includes the governing body's position, and that governing body's position is written with the support of outside counsel. The ISO Board of Governors is also provided the ability to file more quickly in time-critical circumstances, so they have the ability to expedite each of these steps if there's something time-critical happening. If you go to the next slide, our previous recommendation for this proposal, we supported this because we felt like it gave the governing body the opportunity to have a voice in the process, to communicate what their opinion was. And this was a preferred approach over a dual filing concept, which we did look at because it avoided a lot of issues raised by stakeholders. Stakeholders raised concern about process and cost and who would pay for the separate filing. And there were also some concerns about the legality of the dual filing approach. And so we really felt like this provided the same objective of getting the governing body's opinion into FERC's hands and to understand it without dealing with the other issues. So again, questions or options. We're not currently considering any different alternative dispute resolution options. We kind of talked through it and feel like this is a sound dispute resolution option, but we want to hear from you. Does the market structure impact that previous evaluation? And if so, in what way? What is it you'd want us to think about a little bit differently on this? So those are all the slides, all the kind of big concepts on delegation of authority. This is a chance now if anybody has comments or questions on this piece before we move to stakeholder engagement. So operator, if you want to open it up, that'd be great.
Yeah. Once again, if you do have a question or comment, please click on the raise hand icon at the bottom of the Zoom window. All right, we have no comments at this time.
Great. So if we go to the next slide, stakeholder engagement, Tony Braun will do the presentation of the material on stakeholder engagement. Tony.
Thanks, Madam Chair. Appreciate the opportunity to roll through a few slides here to tee up some issues. The area of stakeholder engagement is getting a lot of attention in the West right now, and that's a good thing. I believe with many things that are on the table, we have obviously the engagement here with EDAM and some of the working group structures that were put in place. We have the Western Power Pools Resource Adequacy Program and how they've chosen to set up their governance structure, and of course some of the other discussions like Markets Plus. This issue is getting airtime everywhere, and so we want to make sure that we give it due consideration here and think through what might be some of the options. And I would note there's, I think we have a little bit of flexibility here. We're a little less constrained, I think, by some legal elements, and so a real opportunity to think creatively about how we might augment stakeholder engagement for the benefit of all. So next slide, please. Starting points here. I think every time I'm in one of these calls, there's a little bit of terminology discussion, and so how we're using terms here, I just want to be real clear about it. When we use the term market participants, we talk about those that are actual market participants. They generally associated with load or transmission or generation assets, and that's how we use that term. We use the term stakeholder to mean a much broader set of interested entities that may include NGOs, policy advocates, consumer advocates, and things like that. We already have a stakeholder engagement process. There is the ISO's stakeholder process, open process that I think all on this call are familiar with, and we also have a formal stakeholder body, the Regional Issues Forum. So an obvious question as we consider augmentation or alternative forms of engagement is, what are the implications for RIF? Would any other type of structure replace RIF? Would it just be a reformation of RIF? And what would be the continuing RIF role? And I think there's an implication for the body of state regulators. Does the boss's role change in any of this? And how would the boss's role be affected if we shaped the stakeholder process, say, form a market participants committee like is done in other RTOs or in other structures like the RAP? Does that affect the role of the bosser? And I would note here in passing, or not really in passing, but At the CREPC meeting next week, there are principles that have been posted associated with that agenda by state regulators that are intended to be discussed. So we're not going to take any steam out of those discussions here, but just note for everyone that's on this call that the states are looking actively at these issues. Next slide. So we attempted, hopefully artfully, but perhaps others would disagree, to come up with some graphical depiction of some of the models that are in place right now. I think many are aware. If we start in the right-hand corner, SPP has a very market participant-focused process. They use the term member. We aren't using that here because we really don't have that analog in California ISO parlance. And they are very active in decision making, not just discussion. So it sort of one's a little bit of a bookend. On the other bookend, which we look as the status quo here in the upper left-hand corner, you have the ISO's process where really everyone public is able to engage in the ISO's stakeholder process, listen in, have access to straw proposals, and it is not decisional at all. It really doesn't have any decisional element in it, and it is an informational process. And obviously, as someone that has been involved in that stakeholder process since the inception, it's certainly influential on the direction of the policy, but at the end of the day, there's no decisional role. And so we see these as not really bookends, but sort of areas where in which we're coloring this area and figuring out, how we would fit in this set of options that are before us. Next slide, please. So we tried to really draw out some of the distinctions here and make some contrasts. We have tried to put a list of pros and cons together. I'm sure probably have some reasonable debate on how we characterize it here, but it's really designed to elicit some conversation. Market participant driven, I think some of the pros in that area, at least by the proponents, is the market participants and their customers are the ones that have to live with the market outcomes, so it reflects a skin in the game approach. It really it is something that's attractive to many of the market participants across the West, so it does seem to encourage some buy-in into those market constructs, and it's known. It's something that is used in other RTOs, and so it has some degree of comfort level. Cons for the market-driven approach, I think many have expressed in comments to us that it seems to disenfranchise groups that are not at that important decisional or quasi-decisional table. It is a significant change. It's not something that has been the hallmark of the CAISO's process to date and how the governance structure revolves around it. It may raise some complex voting and how to weight voting or whether to weight voting and how that all works. We have heard from state regulators that it may require some changes to the boss's role if the state market participants are imbued with a very strong decisional role. And of course, I think this sort of an analog is to the top is that it's it's a narrower set of interests that are primary to the decisional process. Stakeholder driven, it looks similar to what is the process today. It's inclusive. It avoids some of the complex voting decisions that might be triggered. And we believe, and we're going to test, that it's complementary to the existing bossor role and may simplify some of those conversations. The other cons on that is many view it as somewhat unwieldy, and that some of the technical complexity that is inherent in these discussions on market design issues are not well suited to some of the broader stakeholder conversations. Next slide, please. I think common things that we'd like to emphasize as a committee, as we've thought through these things, is the challenges of these processes should not be underestimated. It really takes a lot of time and investment on the part of stakeholders or participants in the decision-making process. So if we were to, for example, have an expectation that the RIF was going to produce a written work product, that's not a trivial exercise. That is something that really is going to require ownership from stakeholders and those engaged in that process. So the expectations, I think, go up. It's not a matter of just having just expressing an opinion at a meeting. It's an expectation that there's going to be a level of dialogue that will help shape policy, and that that's going to maybe create some disadvantages for stakeholders that are less resourced in their ability to have a meaningful engagement in that. Another takeaway that we wanted to lay out there is we have heard almost uniformly that the EDAM working group processes were well received. The staff facilitated discussions. We have had stakeholders bring forward fairly well-developed proposals on some of the EDAM discussions. And so we're looking at, are there ways we can integrate similar working group structures into any stakeholder process that comes out of this, given that the EDAM working group process was very well received. I would note, we're not expecting 6 meetings a week on every issue like we had in EDAM. So please don't confuse the working group process with the cadence of EDAM in particular. But still, it's a different model where staff really facilitated the discussions rather than led them, and it seems to have had quite a positive feedback on that. Next slide, please. So, options for EDAM. Do we include stakeholders more in the design? I think this is another slide was just a graphic of what we've already talked about. And so I'd say let's just move on to the final slide here for our subset so we can make sure we get enough time for comments. So next slide, please. So concepts being considered, create a facilitation role for staff similar to the working group. Transition RIF to a more formal advisory policy review committee. Try to funnel the broader stakeholder processes through the advisory committee on relevant real-time and day-ahead market issues. Does this have us reconsider the composition of RIF? Perhaps not. We just did that. So maybe we're good, but we'd like input on that. RIF charter, it's an open question, I think. Does the GRC really get into that, or do we leave that to the RIF? But does it require, I think you could argue both sides of this, the RIF may be fully empowered. Does it require those changes? Do we go so far as to create an expectation that there will be opinions and reports to the governing body and the board on key issues? And then what, beyond market design in particular, do we go to like the multi-year roadmap and things like that? And so so that's sort of it in a nutshell. That's a lot. I know that there's ongoing dialogue on this. I would encourage any members of the GRC to opine here, but I think that sort of encapsulates the things we're thinking about on this matter.
Great. Tony, I think you have one more slide with a couple of key questions beyond just these.
Sorry about that. I thought I was done. The process, again, I think I alluded to this in the prior slide. How much does the GRC really leave to the people that are going to have to do the work? How would that work? How would it interface? Would it create complexity and maybe duplication on things that we're not contemplating in EDAM right now, like transmission planning? What kind of deference would there be? I think for it to work well, I'm not creating a rebuttable presumption that somehow everything would get rubber stamped, but if there isn't a meaningful consideration of something that would come out of an advisory committee by the board and the governing body, then we're not really worth doing it, I think. And how would you really structure that in a way that gets the meaningful input into the governing body and the board for consideration? So those are the things that we really would appreciate comments here or and in writing. I see Mr.
Eric.
Yeah, Therese, can I make some comments? This is Eric Eisenman. Thank you, Tony, for outlining this. So, just an acknowledgement that the current stakeholder process is definitely not perfect. And I also want to acknowledge that the CAISO staff and management has to broker and thread the needle on many difficult policy matters, and they've been doing that for years, and it's a tough job. The scenarios that Tony has outlined with respect to stakeholder engagement changes, at this point, I'm not convinced that those kinds of significant changes are needed. But with that said, I want to hear stakeholder comments, whether it's today or in writing in the next several weeks, because I could be convinced otherwise. And so, I'm going to repeat myself, but I think I'm speaking for myself and all my colleagues on the Governance Review Committee. We want to hear from you on these ideas that Tony has outlined. I'm especially interested in hearing from I'll call it California-focused stakeholders, the IOUs and other entities that are based in California. So thank you, Tony and Therese.
Great, thanks. And we'll turn, actually the operator will ask for comments, but while we're doing that, I want to just be clear about a couple of things. So we are going through an informal process in May. We welcome you. If you want to send comments, we're going to give you the opportunity and kind of the option for doing that. We're not asking for formal comments at this point. We'd really like to have dialogue with you, but those are options. So we'll talk about that just in case people are going to start wondering, when's the comment deadline? There isn't a comment deadline. There's a conversation that we'd like to have over the month of May. So operator, if you want to open it up, if stakeholders have questions or comments for any one of the GRC members or Tony specifically on this stakeholder piece.
All right. So once again, if you do have a comment, please go ahead and click on the raise hand icon. And in the meantime, we do have one comment in the queue. Bonnie, please go ahead.
Hi, can you hear me? Hello?
Yes, we can.
Yeah, good. Bonnie Blair, I'm an attorney. I represent the Six Cities group, participating transmission owners and market participants located in Southern California. They're all municipal electric systems. I throw out sort of it's really a question, and it's really, to me, an important consideration as you kind of work your way through some of these options. The CAISO's stakeholder processes are fairly intensive, and they involve a pretty heavy resource lift from people who are active in those processes, and it takes up a lot of my time and my partner's time, and it takes up a lot of time for the folks who are on the city's operational staffs and are also, running electric systems while they're following the CAISO's processes. So I guess I have a concern about potential duplication of effort and spreading even more thinly resources that are already sometimes strained. And that doesn't mean there couldn't be some incremental process that would be valuable and would provide different perspectives. But I guess I would urge you all to be mindful of the kind of the resource limitations of really all market participants. I don't think my clients are the only ones who sometimes find it to be a heavy lift to keep up with the CAISO processes, but then to add yet another layer, yet another set of processes without somehow trying to mitigate that duplication of effort problem would be a concern for me.
Yeah. Well taken, Bonnie. It's and we've alluded to that, I think, in our conversations. That will be certainly an issue that we are is going to be very foremost in our mind. Yeah. Speaking personally, if we do move to something that creates an advisory body in a more formal way, I would hope that it would help streamline some of the underlying discussions such that it wouldn't be viewed as purely incremental or duplicative. If we couldn't accomplish that, then I would really have to pause as to where we would go on this. And your point is one of the reasons that we had that bullets in one of the prior slides. I just don't think anyone that is listening to this that doesn't engage in these now should think of them as some sort of light-handed effort. It really is resource intensive, no matter how you cut it, and so that should clearly not be underestimated. But of course, we have tens of billions of dollars that flow through these markets, and so they are worth our time and attention.
Any other questions, Roy?
All right. It looks like we have no further comments or questions in queue.
Great. Thanks. Let's move on to the next section, which will be presented by Andy Campbell. If we go to the next slide, the next section is market design elements and roadmap. Andy.
All right. Thanks, Therese. Next slide, please. So the EDAM market will be much more economically significant than the EIM market, and that's a big part of why we're talking about governance right now. But in addition to the large economic value, the EDAM market could touch on a balancing authority areas or state regulators' control and obligations in new ways. So this slide lists some EDAM market elements, market design elements that have this sort of character, and could raise governance questions for stakeholders. The GRC wants to recognize these issues and others raised by stakeholders as we deliberate over our governance recommendations. So I'll kind of read through them now. The first is load shedding policy. Another is whether or how the design relates to balancing authority areas NERC compliance obligations. Third is how EDAM's treatment of transmission intersects with state policy. And another is greenhouse gas accounting and implications on state policy compliance. I should say this list is prior to having looked at the draft straw proposal that came out yesterday, and also we very much want to hear more stakeholders' kind of thoughts here. So I guess the key questions. One is what other market design elements relate to or impact a BAA's or state regulators' responsibilities or control. For example, we've begun to talk about whether state distributed energy resource policy could be something that people will be thinking about. And then also, next question is then how do these elements impact governance? Next slide. So Western EIM governance has been evolving in concert with the growing size and coverage of the market. While the GRC's current effort is focused on EDAM governance, stakeholders have urged us to signal a direction toward even further governance changes that can deepen integration across the West. We have reflected this objective in the proposed guiding principles that Rebecca presented earlier by stressing the need to make recommendations that, I'll just read the part, support or advance a potential future governance structure appropriate for a multi-state regional transmission organization. So this, like looking further down the road, is very much in, core to the governance review that we're doing now. As part of our EDAM recommendations, we may recommend that the EIM governing body and the ISO Board of Governors support further governance reforms in collaboration with state governments, local regulatory authorities, market participants, and other stakeholders, recognizing that those steps are not going to be kind of in the sort of control and authority of those boards. So very much will involve a collaborative effort going forward. And so this could include pursuing shared governance approaches that are not currently possible. So a key question for stakeholders here is, what are meaningful signposts of progress toward a potential governance structure appropriate for a multi-state regional transmission organization? So I'll pause there. Big topic, obviously, and certainly appreciate any comments on this now and later.
Then once again, if you would like to make a comment, please click on the raise hand icon. And it does look like we have one comment in the queue. Michelle, please go ahead.
Sure. This is Michelle Quito from the CPUC. Can you explain what you mean by these could include pursuing shared governance approaches that are not currently possible?
Yeah, so I think what that's getting at, I think something that'll be, is core to our prior recommendations and will be to our new recommendations is taking a very careful look at the law and kind of, what are the legal boundaries that we're working within in terms of, governance changes that can be brought forward at this point in time. I think, of course, there's also just stakeholder perspectives and political perspectives and other things around. So I think so this is sort of getting at whether we as a governance review committee might want to opine on a direction that goes beyond that would require changes in law, for example.
Okay, so you're talking about the law that the state of California considered changing several years ago, but chose not to. Is that what you're talking about? So changing the law so CAISO is not under, the board members are not recommended by the governor. Is that what you're proposing?
Well, I wouldn't say it's not a proposal, but that is one area that stakeholders have brought up. I expect that there's maybe other state laws in other states and many other kind of considerations that come into play when we look at future governance changes. So I would definitely encourage people stakeholders to look beyond that specific issue, which has clearly been called out and is by a number of stakeholders. Okay, so
can you just maybe opine a little bit on what other ones other than that one specifically, so that we can develop our comments specifically?
Yeah, well, I think here we're looking, this is a question, this is an open-ended slide. I think we don't have other ones that we're putting forward right now. And we'd really like to hear, stakeholder perspectives on other barriers, but really importantly on just what's the direction, what's the end point that, we, in the view of each stakeholder, should be trying to work toward.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you.
All right, looks like we have no further comments or questions at this time.
Okay, thanks. Let's go to the next section, which is, I think we titled it Other Areas. We can go to the next slide. It is Other Issues. Rob Taylor's going to present the first slide, and then I'll pick up from there, kind of the wrap up. So Rob, go ahead.
Thank you, Teresa. Appreciate that. And I want to thank everybody for joining us today. So I'm just going to talk a little bit about an area we've been looking at around board selection process. If we could go to the next slide. And we had heard from several commentators or commenters recommending that we make some changes to the board selection process that would allow for greater regional representation as it relates to the ISO Board of Governors. We would note that the existing board nominating committee already includes 2 non-California representatives. And there's also no current legal limitation on advancing a non-California candidate. Our understanding is that has been done in the past. Just a couple of things not on the slide to think about here, though, is obviously this is a political consideration here. The California governor is actually not required to even select someone out of the nomination process. He could go beyond that. But the thought is we'd love to get some feedback on this as to whether or not this would be helpful to non-CAISO participating members in EDAM to sort of see greater representation on the ISO board from non-California entities. We're also considering a couple of other changes. One would be sort of aligning the criteria for selection, as well as the nominating committees for both the ISO Board of Governors and a potential EDAM governing body. This kind of goes back to one of the principles that Rebecca talked about as to whether or not you can make changes that would ultimately lead towards greater regional and support a multi-state regional process. So if you could, and if you look at the selection criteria right now for the ISO Board of Governors and that for the EIM governing body, they're relatively the same. It's just some wording changes that we think you'd really need to make. So we'd love to get some feedback on that. And then the final one that I'll note is considerations around whether or not we can include some statements around the value of regional markets and the importance of regional considerations in either an ISO mission statement or a policy document that would affect the ISO as another method of sort of just stressing the importance of these issues and trying to help provide some additional guidance as the ISO makes decisions. So those are the items that I was going to cover. Happy to answer questions if there are any. And I see it looks like there's at least 2.
All right. Once again, if you do want to make a question or comment, please click on the raise hand icon. We'll go ahead and go to our first comment. Please go ahead. Caller, please go ahead. All right, we'll go ahead and move on to our next caller in the meantime. Jeff, please go ahead.
Thank you. I wasn't sure if I was the previous caller. Can you hear me? Can you hear me? Can you hear me now?
Yes, I can, Jeff.
Okay, great. My question had to do with the ISO Board of Governors selection process and something I wasn't clear on. The previous discussion might actually require a change in law in California, and I'm wondering if the GRC feels it's within their scope to recommend change of law. And the corollary question is, even changing the ISO's Board of Governors selection process would require, as I recall, change in ISO tariff. So a parallel question, does the GRC believe changes in the ISO tariff are within its scope? So both changes in law and changes in ISO tariff, what's your view on what's in scope, what's out of scope?
So let me just speak to this issue as it relates to the nominating process. We did not see, at least we weren't looking at changes to the law that would be necessary to effectuate some of the things that we were considering. So we hadn't, those areas we didn't feel we needed to change a lot to make some of those types of changes. And class, we have not looked at the tariff to see if there are changes yet. So we'll take a look at that as well.
Okay, so what you didn't say, but I heard is that change in ISO tariff are in scope, change in law is out of scope.
I'm not saying that either is in scope or out of scope. What I'm saying is the changes that we looked at in particular as it relates to changes to the potential nominating process would not have involved a change of law, and that we have not looked at whether or not it would be necessary to make a change in scope for the tariff.
Okay, I would suggest that you make changes in law out of scope or any recommendations the GRC would make. That's just my suggestions. Change in tariff, I think, is much more doable. Thank you.
Thank you. Okay, with that, I'll turn it over, Teresa, to the next section. Thank you.
Great, thanks. Can we go to the next slide? Next slide is a summary slide. So this is kind of trying to capture a summary of the options, the big options. And I want to emphasize these are the big things. There might be, smaller things when we get down to the level of detail of full governance, but that we want to have conversation about. So type of delegation of authority, primary or joint, with some evaluation of other decision-making process changes under the primary or joint. Scope of delegation of authority, we have 4 that we've kind of laid out there, so we kind of want to chat with you about that. Stakeholder role in market design, that kind of the big picture concept that Tony laid out there, and I really like the graphic. It gives it a really nice way of being able to say, I kind of want it to be more inclusive. I want more or less. So what are some of the thoughts that people have about more of a stakeholder advisory body? Aligning the board selection process to support regional representation, the things that Rob just talked about, and then also aligning their mission statements to have similar representation of regional consideration between the ISO board and the governing body. And that's mentioned there because the EIM governing body has a mission statement that talks about kind of value to all market participants and existing ISO, full ISO members in the California Balancing Authority area. So kind of looking for something like that. The one thing that's not on this summary page is a big question that I just realized Andy had mentioned, which is what are meaningful signposts or mileposts towards moving towards a governance structure that would support an RTO type structure. And so that's also a question that we would have for folks as we have conversation over the next month. So if we go to the next slide, the next slide is just that. We want to have this informal stakeholder outreach. Now at the bottom, it says, if you want to submit a comment to us, if you want, whether it's a question, whether it's a comment, anything you want to get to us, there's an email there. It will come to all of us. So all of the GRC members will get it if you want to do that. What we were trying to avoid, because we know you just got a big market design package yesterday, we were trying to avoid having a written comment period on top of a written comment period that you already have. So we're going to be at the Body of State Regulators meeting on Monday next week. We're going to be at the Regional Issues Forum meeting on Wednesday of next week. We also are going to have a portion of the EDM straw proposal meeting dedicated to governance issues. On March 26th, they'll be dedicated to governance issues. And then we want to do informal outreach with you. So we will kind of be going as a GRC trying to do outreach to the folks that we typically work with, but we also invite you to contact any GRC member for a briefing or with any suggestions or comments. And so the next slide is, again, the list of all of us, even though you heard our names run down several times. And you can, if you don't have contact information for any one of those folks, you can send a note. If you say, I want to reach out to me, for instance, and you don't have my contact information, send a note to that same CAISO email, and they'll get you my contact information, and we can find a way to have a conversation. So the goal here is over the month of May, to go to the next slide, over the month of May to have dialogue about this, because kind of what we want to invite you in is the dialogue that the GRC members are having about this, right? And sometimes it's better to iterate in conversation rather than to write kind of paper back and forth. So for May, we're going to do this informal outreach. The goal is to have a straw proposal out in mid-June, and then have some opportunities to discuss that and have comments due in July. And then we'll look at a revised proposal and then look for comments on a final straw proposal. So this is kind of always, I think, about the next 2 to 3 months are the ones that we know the best. Beyond that, we're kind of we're kind of making it up. It's like the weather, long-term weather forecast, but this is what we've got planned for the next couple of months. Operator, if you want to open it up, if anybody has questions on process or things they want to ask questions about or give input on.
Yeah, once again, if you would like to ask a question or make a comment, please click on that raise hand icon. We'll go ahead and go to our first caller.
Hi, this is Leah Fisher with Public Generating Pool. Are you able to hear me?
Yes, we can.
Oh, great. I think I was double muted before. Sorry about that. Just briefly, my comments are back on slide 27 on the board selection process. And I just wanted to say that we're really pleased to see the creative ideas the GRC has come up with on this issue. We were one of the parties that had, in our comments, suggested exploring potential modifications to board qualifications to ensure that there could be some geographic diversity of experience built in, so both within the CAISO BAA, but also experience outside. And we were also interested in exploring changes to the board nominee review committee, again, to achieve a more balanced representation of stakeholder sectors, both within the CAISO BAA and outside that serve on that committee. So the reason we were suggesting these changes is that we really think they could help achieve a balancing of interests and just support decision-making that's free from bias. So just really pleased to see the suggestions here. I think they could all go a long way into kind of meeting our objectives here, particularly aligning the selection criteria of the Board of Governors and the EIM governing body. I know within that document, there is discussion on qualifications and how those should vary and be broad in terms of geographic representation. So I think incorporating that could potentially be very beneficial, and same to the other points that are included here. So having the nominating committee be the same for the ISO Board of Governors and EIM governing body. I know the EIM governing body, of course, is a really broad sector-based committee, so trying to marry that up for the ISO Board of Governors we think would be beneficial. And then lastly, that adding a goal of regional considerations and the value to regional parties and the ISO mission statement or other policy document, that would really get to some of the interests that we had as well and recommended in our comments about making sure that the Board of Directors' roles and responsibilities would explicitly address considerations for EDM and the impacts on entities outside the ISO footprint. So really appreciate the GRC taking into account those recommendations and coming up with some ideas on how to address those.
Thanks, Leah. Operator, are there any other comments?
Yeah, we do have another comment in queue. Kanya, please go ahead. Kanya, please go ahead and accept unmuting your device.
Apologies. I did have a question about the earlier slide that Andy Campbell covered, mentioning milestones to an RTO governance structure. And, the Oregon study that Andy Campbell actually contributed to pointed out that, while an RTO structure could reduce costs for ratepayers in terms of reserves, it doesn't really solve the issue of cost allocation for transmission. And that's a concern for public advocates. And so that's kind of I think it's a long way to understanding how there can be equitable distribution of costs for transmission and agreement on that. But just want to raise that issue as like very pivotal for ratepayers, or critical for ratepayers. Thank you.
Thanks for that. Yeah, thanks for that comment. I'm going to try and remember that piece by memory. And Andy, maybe you want to comment. What we heard in comments that we received in February, March is that from a governance perspective, people want us thinking about what the governance might look like for an RTO, and we're not really at this point opining whether that's the best next step for the region or not, and how it might address those other things. But to your point, if there's a governance element that's important to get to that transmission cost allocation, that would be important for us to be thinking about.
Thank Thank you.
And what those mileposts and signposts would be. Andy, do you want to say anything further on that?
No, that I agree. I agree with what you said. Thank you.
All right.
Any other comments?
It looks like we do not have any further comments at this time.
Okay, great. Well, thanks again for everybody for joining us on our Friday. That seems to be our public meeting days. So thanks for spending your time with us. And don't be surprised if you hear from one of us in the month of May, or if you don't and you really want to talk to us, please feel free to reach out. That's really what we're hoping for. And then there is a RIF conversation. Specifically, that RIF conversation will be focused on the stakeholder element. So if that's important to you, please join into the RIF next Wednesday. And then May 26th, we will have conversation as well. So thanks again, and look forward to more conversation with you on this. With this, I think our meeting is adjourned. I don't know if we formally end that way. Bert, do we formally end that way?
All right, and that concludes our conference. Thank you for using Event Services. You may now disconnect.